And I'm going to talk a little bit generally about that, and then specifically a method that I used working with the organization of Imago Relationships, which has been Imago Relationships International, is becoming Imago Relationships Worldwide. And so this is an organization that's been around for 30 years, more or less, and it was established as nonprofits are established in the US, which is to say with a board that had authority to act on behalf of the organization, and came to a conclusion that it was time to shift to a more lateral, more relational governance model, and found its way to sociocracy. And so that's that transition that I'm talking about. And I think that's a different thing than for a new group to adopt sociocracy. I think that that transition from having a long history in a hierarchical board kind of situation into sociocracy is a different kind of thing. So with its own challenges. So wanted to sort of share a little bit of theory about that. And one of the concepts that I follow, and this is very much an Imago concept, is that we live both in our conscious space and our unconscious space. And I think that while it's not black and white, I sort of have them on either side of the screen here. The reality is we're usually in both at the same time. So this model is somewhat limited in its precision, but I think has some useful concepts with it. So when we're looking at transition, and so we've got an organization that says, okay, we're going to transition from a traditional, conventional, hierarchical board structure into a sociocratic structure. I'm going to say that I think that the reason that that shift begins to happen is because there's a usually unconscious connection deficit. Somewhere in us, we know that we need to be more connected to each other within the organization, maybe the organization connected beyond as well, but that we have this knowledge somewhere in us that we need more connection, and that I think is one of the driving forces that pushes us to transition into a sociocratic structure. And from there, we look at what our relationship structure is within our organization. We probably think about what our values are, and we probably have some values around equality. And I know that word gets dicey, so I'm going to ask you to sort of bear with me as the language is, we can play with more precise language, but I want to get to sort of broader concepts. So we look at our relational structure, we look at our values, we have a value of equality and welcome and inclusion. And somewhere along the line, we learn about this idea of a lateral structure, that we don't have to have a boss who's in control. We don't have to have a board that runs everything. We don't have to run by Robert's rules. There is this other option out there. And we find sociocracy. And we adopt that sociocratic structure and say, okay, this is the new structure that is going to get us working more collaboratively together, and it aligns with our values. We're going to do sociocracy, which is great. What happens then is that there's a power shift. And I put this on the unconscious side because I think we tend to be less conscious about this. And in fact, power shift was what we were after, right? We wanted to shift from centralized power in one place to spread out power. There's also a shift, I think, when you come to sociocracy about where the power lives. In traditional organizations, I think power lives mostly in the structure. So the person who is named the president has the power of the position of the president. It's awarded by the structure. In sociocracy, there will be people who are much more powerful than others, and those folks will largely get their power from interpersonal relationships and that interpersonal sort of power realm. So there's all sorts of shift in where power lives, how it expresses itself, and how it shows up. And when power shift happens, you can pretty much count on a sense of loss. As that shift happens, the places where power used to exist, particularly for the leadership, they don't have as much power as they did before. And they feel that. And again, notice we're on the unconscious end of this. So these are generally folks who really want to share their power, who really want to be in a lateral kind of relationship, who really want to be sharing everything. And somewhere in them, they still feel this sense of loss. And with that lost power is an incredible amount of vulnerability, and with vulnerability comes fear. And I think that's predictable and reliable and happens anytime you're in any transition. Transition is extremely unsafe space for us as humans. It's where conflict is most likely to happen. And when we get vulnerable in our mainstream culture, the sort of patterns and skills that we've learned from early childhood onward is that we're going to reach for something that feels safer. And in our mainstream cultures, what feels safer is rules. And the rules now that we've adopted are the sociocracy structure. And in the last session, someone was talking about how people said, well, we've got to do rounds and we have to do the aims and domains and we have to do these things. And I think that's what's going on here, is that we're reaching for the rules because rules feel safe. And so we're in this vulnerable place. We don't want to be vulnerable. So we reach for the rules and we dive right into the rounds and the aims and domains and the structures, the rules of sociocracy. And we have this expectation that they're going to save us from our vulnerability in transition. And what that tends to do is launch us back into the focus on the power shift. We're still in our sense of loss. We get this circle going here where we're just hanging out in the structure and in the rules. And I think what we miss when we do that, and we can cycle there for a long time, and I think this is one place where groups end up failing, is in that tight circle. And I think that the real realization that needs to come is that the vulnerability and fear is the experience of that initial connection deficit that led us to look for sociocracy to begin with. So we've got that vulnerability and fear is a connection deficit. We're in that space. One option is to do what we would culturally do. It's pretty normal in our culture, and reach for rules. The other option is to reach for relationship. And when we do that, we get a whole other cycle that begins. So the connection deficit that we're addressing leads us to look into relationship tools. And for me, those are the Imago Relationships tools. I think they're incredibly powerful. There are others that can also work. I'm a do what works for you kind of girl. But I'll talk here about the relationship tools of Imago in particular, since that's my expertise. And when we go into those Imago relationship tools, we're still going to be in our values of equality and inclusion. That's all part of that skill set. And it's going to bring us to listening. It's going to bring us to more presence. So we're going to be really with each other and engaged with each other. That presence is going to give us the connection that we were missing to begin with. And in that connection, we're going to dive into the sociocratic structure in a way that actually works and is very integrated with it. And I would love to say that once we've done this cycle once, then we're done and we never go into the vulnerability and fear thing again. That is not my experience. I think we do cycle and sort of spiral in this. And so we get to the sociocratic structure and we're in a more connected space, and that's great. And there still is power shift, and we still experience a sense of loss, and that safety is much less. So we're still in this vulnerable place, and we always have that option of we can jump back into the rules or we can lean into the relationships. So that's sort of the cycle that I see, and I think we can live that over and over and over again, and we sort of constantly make that choice. And the more often we do it, the easier it is to lean into the vulnerability and the relationship pieces and trust that those relationship tools are going to give us the connection that makes the structure work well for us. So I will pause there for questions or thoughts about that.
I have a comment. So just as you were, going through this cycle, I just immediately started noticing, it's like, oh, doing this conference with all of you, I start, it's like I start feeling the sense of loss, of like, ooh, I was the founder and now there's all these people doing this, and a little bit of feeling of loss of, like my sense of importance or something. But then that sense of, well, as Greg Kendrick likes to say, there's that sense of loss of power, but transform that into a sense of, no, the voice is amplified. Now the voice that I might have had is amplified by Karen's voice. And what Karen is bringing back to me is even, something that improves my practice. So it's you know, there's a cycle of feelings that I just noticed I went through. You know, from the little oh to the oh, you know, just in this moment as I was just sitting here listening to you, Karen.
Can I comment on that a little bit? What I love about what you're sharing, Jerry, is how conscious you are about that. I think that cycle that you're describing of there is this sense of loss and this vulnerability around it, and then leaning into the relationship and the trust in others and feeling empowered and pulled up by that, I think is really common, and I think often unconscious. And so that consciousness that you have of yourself and that you're bringing to all of us about it, I think is incredibly valuable. So just being able to notice that is lovely, and I appreciate you sharing it. I'm just looking at the chat for a minute in case there's, yeah, anything there. So I want to move on, I think. So yeah, that's our choices again. So I want to move into the sort of specific example that I had said I would talk about today, which is that transition that Imago Relationships as an organization has made. As I said, they were a traditional board. They have shifted to a sociocracy structure. And they've been doing this for about 2 years. So it's been a slow process, and we're motivated in part by some pretty clear indications, including some financial ones, that the board structure was not working for them. So I want to talk a little bit about the challenges that this organization has faced in transition, and that I think are pretty common. One is that it's a really large organization. So trying to get everybody on board, trying to get people to collaborate, trying to get people to engage, it's tricky when you've got a whole lot of people all over the world. And the Imago exists, depending on how you count, in somewhere between 17 and 54 countries. So it's big. There is the history of the hierarchical power structures. It does not go away just because you decide you'd like it to. It stays with us, and so that momentum of that hierarchy is still there. There are plenty of power battles in the history, and without going into details, just to say that I think that's probably, I don't know of an organization that's been around for 30 years that hasn't had some kind of power struggle happening, and most of those don't get fully resolved. I think that's one of the things about hierarchical power structures, is that those battles and struggle places don't get worked through well, and there may not be a lot of appetite for doing the relational work that would take to really get through those. So that's another piece that is very present for the Imago organization. Because we're so spread out around the world, we're doing all of our work through remote Zoom participation, and as wonderful as Zoom is, it ain't the same as being in a room together. And so that piece, and you know, there are lots of pieces that come with it. People tend to be more distracted. They're more likely to be multitasking. They sort of come and go through a meeting, in addition to the fact that you can't read each other's energy. You don't feel the same level of trust, the same level of connection, the same level of investment that I think you can get in a room. So that's a challenge. I think we had a pretty significant segmentation of teams, and I think this goes with all of these other pieces that we're talking about, that we had a group that started working on finance, and we had a group that started working on membership, and we had a group that started working on mission. And we came together for our central circle meetings once a month, but there just wasn't enough, I didn't think, integration between those various efforts. So we ended up with these teams doing things, but they were very separate and segmented in different places. So that was a struggle. I put lack of relational skills in parentheses, and I did that because this is not a problem for Imago. The Imago organization, their whole focus is relationship skills and relationship tools, and what these folks have in common is that they teach relationship skills. So they have a very high level of relationship skills, but I wanted to put it here because I do think for most organizations this is a problem. And so I just want to name it in a transition challenge that it's common. What Imago as an organization does have is a lack of application of relationship skills to the organizational setting. So working with a group of people who are absolute masters of relationships in couple settings, in therapy settings, in interpersonal settings, in familial settings, did not turn out to mean that they had that same skill set ready to apply organizationally, and learning to apply what they knew from other parts of their experience into meetings and teams and organizational environments. It is a skill in and of itself. And that was interesting to me to sort of watch that develop. I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat as I'm talking to you, which is its own challenge. But yeah. So moving on from there, the organization kind of got stuck. We were about 2 years in. We had established the central circle. We had John Buck was our consultant, had been hired and was working with the organization. And it was like people were meeting and talking, and we did a ton of listening, and that was all really important. And it was last Thanksgiving, we all kind of took a break because it was the holiday. And when I got together, so I'm the facilitator for the central circle, and got together with the administrator for that circle and said, okay, now what? And we just felt kind of deflated. There, you know, there'd been all this push and energy, but it wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't coalescing anywhere. It wasn't, we were just sort of in this holding pattern where we kept having meetings, but nothing really was happening. And of course, participation was beginning to dwindle. And what we decided to propose, and it was actually very quickly adopted and accepted, was this concept of a summit, a sort of retreat, but we called it a summit, with the goal to create a new framework for the organization, which could be adopted by the central circle. And we really said, we're going to invest in this project, this summit, with the understanding that what's produced here is probably the only option we have, meaning it will be accepted, it will be consented at the central circle, but if it doesn't get consented, we're not sure what happens next, because we'd be back in this spinning decentralized space. And so the summit really was this idea of how do we get from sort of stuck to having enough of a plan that we can start moving forward. So the logistics that were set up that I think were important, it was in person. We made sure that we represented all the primary interest groups, and we originally thought we might be able to do it with 4 people, which would have been a little more efficient maybe. We ended up with 7, and I think it was a really good group. And that included the central circle facilitator, me, and admin, and we facilitated the event. So it was internally facilitated. The 2 of us are newer to the group. We did our training separately, but we just happened to each have done our training at about the same time a couple of years ago. And everyone else that was participating were people who had been with the organization for decades. The founders were there, the master instructors were there. So it was a diverse group in a number of ways, but very small by intention. I think 7 was toward the top end of how many I would want for this kind of activity. We invited cloister, and what I mean by that is we invited folks to set aside their lives, to ask people not to contact them. And in fact, we offered, I won't say anyone took us up on it, but we offered a phone number of someone who wasn't there but was nearby, that, you know, if you want to turn off your phone completely but give your family or people who might need to reach you for an emergency, you can give them this number and this person will answer their phone, and if you're needed, we'll come get you. But you can totally turn off your electronics. We limited the tech. We didn't have any computers in sessions, and I've got a picture here of what we did instead. So at the end, we did not have computer documents. We had these big papers and pictures of them, and you know, ended up transferring notes like that. But getting computers out of the way, I think, was essential to the relationship work that we were doing. We rented a large house, so we were all staying together, sharing a kitchen, being together in that space. And we provided all the meals and any other comforts that we could figure out that anybody needed. So the breakfast and lunches were provided. You know, we just really stocked the kitchen with some basic breakfast, lunch things. And we did a couple of meals out, but it was all organized. So nobody was working on their own logistics. The goal was everyone could be fully present in the work. And it was a 4-day process, including arrival and departure. So we started at 2 o'clock the first day on Friday, and then left about noonish on Monday. Planning for this event. I did pre-summit interviews, meaning I spoke to each person from the same set of prompts. So everybody who was participating did this interview. And I also was on the receiving end of the interview. I had our circle administrator lead me through the same set of prompts with lots of mirroring, which is an Imago skill. Also called in other frames, active listening, or there are lots of ways to say it, but essentially that practice of repeating back what you've heard. So lots of that. We did a needs survey, so we sent out, what kinds of foods do you want? We're gonna stock the kitchen, what do you want in it? That kind of thing, any special needs you might have. We worked really hard at establishing that this was a space of lateral relationships. And one example of that, as most homes that you might rent would be, this one had a master suite. And we really debated about what to do with that. And as it happens in our group, there was one couple attending who were the founders, and so it would have made a certain amount of logistical sense to give the couple who were sharing 2 people to a room that larger space. And we decided not to do that because the founders, as the founders, were already inherently holding way more power. They're naturally in a hierarchical role that they don't necessarily ask for, but it is so familiar to everyone that it's this reinforced thing. And we felt like to put them in a room that anyone would recognize as the master bedroom and give them that sort of preferential space was to reinforce a hierarchy pattern when we were really working for lateral relationships. And so in fact, we gave no one the master bedroom. We called it the community room. We did some ritual work there. Haley's the circle administrator that was my partner in all of this, and she and I shared a room, which made it possible to have that master be not occupied. And we sent that information out in advance to the participants and just said, we're really watching power dynamics and we're trying to disrupt any differentials in power. There will be some, and we recognize that, but one of them is we're not using the master bedroom as a bedroom. I was pretty limited in how I shared the agenda in advance. I'll tell you a little bit about what I did share, but I did not send out a minute-by-minute plan. Some people would have been more comfortable if I had done that, but we opted to bring people together without a lot of expectations intentionally. The early days were planned in a whole lot of detail, and we're very much in the relational Imago facilitation realm. And then as the later days we relied much more on sociocracy, but also the plans going in were much looser because of course what we did on day 3 was very much dependent on what had come out of days 1 and 2. So that was sort of how that planning went. We also thought it was really important as this little group of us met to stay connected with the whole organization. And in fact, there were a lot of concerns from others in the organization about, isn't this just another example of some central group, dictating to everybody else? And where is the transparency in this? And how do we get that sense that it's on behalf of the whole organization? And so we really thought about how do we stay as this small group connected with the hundreds or thousands of people that we are in some way representing. One thing we did was we invited support. So even though we had this cloister where there was no coming and going, we didn't have people entering our workspace, we did have people who were volunteers who picked people up from airport and were that kind of support. We invited notes of appreciation and care packages, and in fact, one cluster from another part of the country mailed gift bags for each person each day. There were little things to open that reminded us of these other people whose energy was also in this transition and movement toward creating the new organization. We included whole community awareness in centering language and in check-ins. We spoke of it to each other within the summit a lot. And we did a few minimal reports out. We really intentionally did not promise a lot of that. But we did a ton of reporting at the end. So following the summit, we reported what we'd done in all kinds of ways. So, when we shared photos of our activities and we shared poetry and we shared proposals that we had drafted. And so everything from very feeling creative space to the very sort of nuts and bolts of what did we do. I put this picture here because it's an example of one time that we were really intentional about thinking about who all are we representing and who all will be impacted by the work we're doing. And so the little Post-it notes are various groups within the organization, and then we used the yarn to link and create all the links, and this is just one small piece of that. So the agenda that I sent out the first agenda that I sent out to the group is exactly what you're seeing, which is that the agenda, we sent a bunch of logistical stuff, and I said, okay, so the first thing I'm going to tell you, the agenda is connection. We are here to get connected because what I believe is that connection creates outcomes that individuals cannot. So we are trusting that in that space of connection, the thing that we need will show up. The structures that we need, the ways that we put things together will show up. And I will say this is an easier sell in Imago than it would be probably in another organization, because Imago is all about connection. Connection is a really high value. And the work that we do with couples is we create connection, and in that connected space, they work through their problems. So it may be an easier sell there than it would be for another organization. And I think that getting organizations connected is absolutely essential, and we often miss that piece. So, so that's where I started. We used a developmental approach. Again, this is part of Imago theory, and in fact, this is part of basic psychology. If you've studied psychology, you've probably seen something like this. So the concept in psychology is that from infancy forward, we go through some stages of development. And what I believe, and part of the Imago frame around facilitation, is that we not only do that from infancy through about age 8, which is the first round, but we repeat that personally, and also that groups go through those same stages of development. And I think it's an interesting frame to think about, okay, so what are we missing, and where are things not latching the way that they need to? And so I find thinking about these 4 pieces, they don't always happen in order, but it helps if they do, I think. And so the structure of the summit agenda was that the first day we did attachment. The second day we did exploration and identity. So the attachment piece is getting connected. Exploration, let's just play with ideas. Let's try some things on. Let's see where this might go. Let's, you know, that very expansive sort of brainstorming, but I think even broader than brainstorming. And then the identity. So with all of that exploration, like, who are we, and who are we? And as a new organization, who are we becoming? What is the identity of this new thing that we're creating? And then day 3 was competence, which is the I can do it. And that was very much more sociocracy. So now we're getting into the nuts and bolts of the proposals and how do we do it and how do we get it done. And then day 4, which I'll talk more about in a bit, was to sort of launch. So once we're competent, how are we going to get this out into the broader organization? So I'm going to go through really quickly kind of what I did to get each of those things to happen. And it's going to be really fast because we're short on time, but I just want to give you a sense of how it rolled out. Key Imago tools that were familiar to everyone in the room, and I'd say more than familiar, these were sort of expert, this group was expert at these things, which is helpful and made it easier. In another group, I'd have to teach them, and I'd take the time to teach them. But mirroring, which others call reflective listening, active listening, there's lots of, that is common to many practices. Validation, which is the real clarity that what people say does make sense from their frame, and to honor that and name it. Empathy, which I suspect is familiar to all of you, just really taking time to notice and to feel along with people what they're feeling. We did a lot of 2-person structured dialogue. So even in this small group of 7, we broke off into pairs a lot, especially in the early days, the attachment time. We used sentence stems, and I just gave you an example there. So a sentence stem is really just a grammatical restructuring of a question. So it is important to me that, as opposed to saying, what's important to you? And we do that because it makes people less defensive. So that's one of our key things. And we did a lot of centering. You know, every time we came together, we took time to get energetically, emotionally present in the room together. So this is the quick rundown of what we did. So day one was attachment, and as I said, we gathered through the morning, and actually most of us were there, had arrived the day before, but we sort of settled, got on the right time zone, that kind of thing, and started at about 2 o'clock. And did an arrival and centering little ritual that was short, came together in our workspace and did consent to ground rules, which we had done in advance, and an initial agenda, and just naming that the agenda would shift, but an initial agenda consent. And that was also an introduction to sociocracy. So a reminder that in this group, the Imago tools were old hat, had them solid. Sociocracy is new. So I'm teaching sociocracy. I mean, they theoretically know it, but they kind of don't. So I'm teaching sociocracy as we go. So this was an initial introduction, bringing sociocracy into the room. With that, consented to the agenda. And then we did a ritual around really releasing the history, naming, when you're in an organization like that, there is a ton of attachment to the old structures. There are safety, there what's worked, there what's familiar. And so I sent to Ted, and I'm sure he will share with you a document that has actually the language I used for the ritual. So you're welcome to read that and adapt it for your use. But we actually held stones to represent all of those old structures and said, we may or may not go back and get them, but for now we're going to set these aside in what I called a storage closet. And we literally set them in a closet, and in that closet took in their place blank notebooks. Each person had a notebook with their name on it and a pen. And so setting down that, all of that structure that we had if we wanted it, but that we needed to set aside to look at new, and picking up this blank slate. We then did a visioning meditation around sort of what is the energy, the identity, what does Imago mean to us? What does the organization mean to us? And again, the language for that is in that shared document that you'll have. And then we did a responsive group art project, and we probably spent an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours on this, and that's what you're seeing here. We had a huge dining room table, happens to be in this house that we rented, and we covered it with butcher paper and lots of markers, and music was playing, and we sort of talked and shared, and you had that creative space around that. We did a short, maybe 10 minutes of silent individual writing for reflection, just keeping people connected with themselves. And then we did a dyad structure, so pairs of people with sentence stems that were provided. And again, I've given those to you in the document so you can see. Did a series of 3 dyads, so essentially each person paired with each of 3 other people. And what I find is that getting that paired connection happening brings an incredible sense of connection to the group as a whole. There is so much more safety with 1 person than with 7. That you can get, and getting the sense of safety with 1, it transfers into the whole group. And so we took about an hour of dyad sharing and then did another hour to sort of bring that back to the whole group. And that is all around getting people fully present in the room, willing to be vulnerable. So that was the first day. We went out to dinner together, and that was day 1. Day 2 was about exploration, and the morning in particular was really exploring. We did always take time for check-in and centering and getting people in the room. So we did those things. And then we did a relationship vision exercise. And again, this would have been a little bit familiar to the people I was working with because they do it with couples. But we adapted it to work with a group. And we actually had 9 topics. And everybody had their little notebook that they'd gotten out of the closet. And in their notebook, for each topic, we set a timer for 5 minutes. And we asked them to come up with 10 visions at least. The idea is fast and furious, let ideas flow, stretch yourself. You think I'm done? There's more. And reach for that more, which is why we sort of pushed that 10, minimum 10. And what you're writing are visions in the present tense. So a financial vision might be, our organization has plenty of money to do everything we want to do. It's stated in the present tense as though it already is. And so writing those kinds of statements So it took us a while to do 9 of them with 5 minutes of writing in each one. And we did not immediately share them. There was some push for that. I will say this is the point in the weekend when the revolt against facilitation happened, when people said, wait, we don't want to do that. What if we did it this other way? And we paused and talked through that and how would that work? And at some point, someone in the room said, you know what, you guys have really thought through this really well and you really have a plan for this. I think we should trust that. And I went, oh, good. But there was, it's worth naming that happened because it will happen. It's a when and not if. You'll get some pushback on something like this. So we did that writing time, and then we got again in pairs, dyads, to process that writing, and then came back and processed it as a whole group. We did a midday break. We gave everybody 2 hours. You need that, especially if you have folks traveling across time zones, but even if not. Lunch was just self-serve, so it was, you know, very casual. We encourage people to get outside and walk if nature can be available. We also encourage people to sleep. Sleep lets you integrate what you've been working on, so it gets that integration time. So to literally go lie down somewhere and close your eyes. And we asked them not to do shop talk, not to talk about the content of the summit, to just be together or not, to take time alone, to pair off, to walk, whatever you want to do. And of course, this is also a window for the facilitator to adjust the agenda, which from this point on in the weekend, I was doing constantly. The afternoon was more around trying to center in on identity. We did some work on mission type work. We did some small group, you know, breaking off into 2 groups of 3 and 4 and doing some proposal generation and some processing of that. Notice we're still not making decisions. We're still not very sociocratic. We're very much in the Imago world, and there's some overlap, but we're not pushing for decisions yet. We're still sort of gelling on where are we headed and a broader path. And we did some work on some big topics, and I'm not going to go into the specifics because they wouldn't really transfer, but you know, in any group, there's going to be a couple of just sort of big, tough, entrenched topics. And this was a space where we took time to work 1 or 2 of those in a really thorough way and taking, you know, where you can do it in a big chunk of time. And again, we went out to dinner as a group that night. And dinner was also a no shop talk space. We talked about anything else. Day 3, competency, and this was energy shift. So, you know, there's this awareness in the group of this is our last full day together. We've got to get this done. The organization is counting on us to have a plan, and it's time to get things written. I shifted that energy really intentionally. We still were, you know, we still connected. We still did check-ins. We still did centering. But it's a more contracting energy. It's a more focused energy. We're really looking at efficiency. And we introduced again and really focused on good enough for now, safe enough to try. We actually put those words on a little like tent, table tent kind of, you know, folded paper just in the middle of our circle on the floor where everybody could see good enough for now, safe enough to try. We ended up using the acronym letters, and we talked a lot that weekend about Geffenset. So that huge shift in energy. We did do our check-in and centering, as I said, small group work on detailed proposals, large group decision rounds, and sort of repeated that cycle. We took a lunch break. It was a little shorter that day, although I don't necessarily recommend that. It was an odd day for some reasons that were just unique to our situation. And then we really focused by the end of the day on the transition plan. Like now we've got an idea, but that doesn't mean the work is done. So what are the next steps? What has to be done by what time? What is the timeline? Who's going to do what? Who's taking responsibility? Who that's not here are we pulling into this and, you know, inviting to do tasks? Dinner was a working dinner. There were, you know, plenty of leftovers from our breakfast and lunch stuff in the fridge, and we just used those. We did have a plan for a takeout, you know, a delivery option if we had needed it, but just knowing that you're sort of on the downhill point. I'm seeing Jerry say 2 minutes, and I'm just about at the end. And then day 4 was launch. We again did check-in, and it turned out to be really important to do a lot of check-in. And then it was all about strategies for sharing. So, and we looked at all the different ways we could do that. And then we did a closing ritual where we returned to that opening round ritual, pulled the stones back out in sort of a pyramid, and did appreciations and feelings as closing round. And I said, and then the work begins. Because although it's 4 days of pretty intensive work, it really is to launch the rest of the project. So I know we're right at the end, and I had a ton to share, so I took all of our time doing that, but I am happy to take questions if we have time for them.
Just quickly, what was the size of the group?
The group that met was 7 people. And I wouldn't go much bigger than that.
Yeah, I have heard that, but I was not sure.
Yeah. Other quick questions as we're wrapping up?
I have one more question.
Great.
Are you part of the group and also lead the implementation at the same time?
Yes. And there was some pushback against that as well. The decision for that was partly a budget decision. We didn't necessarily have funding to hire someone outside. And it was also partly a decision about feeling like it was really important for the Imago facilitation tools that are so much a part of the culture of this group to be used. And anyone who has those is by definition a member of the group. And so we made that decision and found it worked very, very well. The feedback from others was that there wasn't that sort of participant bias that would have been expected. And I was really, really, really careful. And I definitely was lead facilitator, but our administrator, who is amazing, was walking with me in part of the planning and also my check-in. So there was very much conversation between she and I about, wait, am I headed into bias? Have I lost my neutral space? Where do we need to go with this? And there were points where I just plain took my facilitator hat off and said, okay, I'm not the facilitator at this moment, I need to speak, and could say that. And it worked, but I think it's a really important point, and I think it only worked because we were really careful about it.